The courtroom went silent as the lawyer held up a photograph of a cell from Pelican Bay's security housing unit, the SHU. The walls were grey and bare, the metal bed chained to the ground, and no window let in daylight. The shocking part wasn't the emptiness of the room, it was the scratch marks. Dozens of them. Scratches that spelled words like help and I'm still alive. Some looked like they were carved with fingernails, desperate and bloody. The lawyer's voice shook as he told the judge, "Men were kept here, locked 23 hours a day, for decades. No sunlight, no touch, no end date." A murmur spread across the courtroom. People shifted in their seats, reporters scribbled notes, and even the judge leaned forward. The lawyer wasn't just describing a prison cell. He was building the case that Pelican Bay's SHU had broken men's minds and bodies, and that it was not just cruel, but illegal. But the real bombshell came when one of the witnesses stood up. He was an older prisoner, grey hair and thin as a stick, shackled in chains as guards flanked him. He looked straight at the jury and said, "I spent 30 years in that box. 30 years with no human contact. I sued because the SHU wasn't punishment. It was torture. And what I found in those walls will shock you." The room froze. What did he mean by what I found in those walls? Before he could finish, the judge banged the gavel, calling for order. Everyone leaned forward, desperate to know what was hidden in Pelican Bay's SHU, but the words hung in the air like a knife ready to drop. That was the peak. The lawsuit was no longer just about solitary confinement. It was about secrets buried in Pelican Bay. And now, we rewind to how it all began. Pelican Bay Prison was built in 1989, tucked in the forests of Northern California, far from big cities, far from curious eyes. It was designed as a fortress with razor wire, guard towers, and concrete walls that looked more like a war zone than a prison. Inside its walls was the SHU, the place where prison officials sent the so-called worst of the worst. Gang leaders, violent offenders, men accused of organizing crimes from inside prison walls. At first, the SHU sounded simple. Isolate dangerous men so they couldn't control others. In practice, it was a different story. Prisoners spent 23 hours a day in a windowless cell, the size of a bathroom. The 1 hour of exercise they got wasn't outside. It was in another concrete box called the Dog Run, with nothing but high walls and a sliver of sky. No programs, no classes, no visits without glass between you and your family. Many men were locked away not for violent acts, but simply for being suspected of gang ties, sometimes based only on tattoos, artwork, or even a book they had read. For years, the SHU was invisible to the outside world. Guards followed orders, prisoners stayed silent, and the public believed Pelican Bay was keeping California safe. But inside, men were losing their minds. Some stopped talking altogether. Some banged their heads against the wall until they bled. A few wrote desperate letters to lawyers, describing hallucinations, voices in the vents, and the feeling that time itself had died. One of those letters landed on the desk of a young lawyer named Jules LaBelle. He had handled tough cases before, but nothing like this. When he visited Pelican Bay, he couldn't believe what he saw. The silence in the SHU wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of despair. The men he met spoke slowly, their eyes hollow, like they hadn't seen hope in years. One whispered to him, "They're burying us alive, but above ground." It wasn't just heartbreaking, it was enraging. LaBelle knew that keeping men in cages for decades without sunlight or touch was something international. Now courts called torture. Yet here it was, happening in California. That was when he decided to take the fight to court, but lawsuits against prisons were never simple. The state argued that solitary confinement was necessary to stop prison gangs from running drug trades and ordering murders on the streets. Officials claimed the SHU was the only way to keep California safe, and when Lobel first filed the case, he faced threats, intimidation, and endless legal roadblocks. Still, he gathered more prisoners willing to speak out. Men who had spent 20, even 30 years in those concrete boxes. Their testimonies painted a picture of horror. Men who hadn't touched another human in decades, who hadn't seen trees, grass, or the ocean in half their lives. They were breaking down, and yet their voices carried power. But just when the lawsuit was beginning to gain attention, something happened inside Pelican Bay itself that changed everything. Prisoners who had been silent for years suddenly rose up in a way no one expected. One summer morning, guards walked down the tiers for breakfast rounds. But instead of men reaching for trays, they found cells where trays sat untouched. Prisoners weren't eating. The SHU had gone on hunger strike. And that was the spark. The guards were stunned. Inmates refusing food was nothing new, but this was different. Dozens of men inside the SHU had coordinated the strike. Tray after tray sat untouched, the smell of cold oatmeal and bread hanging in the air. For men who had been locked in isolation for decades, refusing food was the only weapon they had left. And now they were using it. Day after day, the strike grew. Word spread from one prison to another. Soon it wasn't just Pelican Bay. Thousands of prisoners across California joined in, refusing to eat. Outside, families held rallies with signs that read, "Stop the torture and end the SHU." For the first time, the invisible walls of Pelican Bay cracked open and the public began to ask, what's really going on in there? Inside the SHU, the hunger strike was brutal. Some men collapsed after a few days. Others shook with weakness but still refused food. Doctors warned that if the strike continued, men would die. The prison administration tried to break their will. They offered extra privileges, whispered threats, even hinted at force-feeding. But the prisoners stayed firm. Their demand was simple: an end to indefinite solitary confinement. This was the turning point. The lawsuit Jules Lobel had filed years earlier now had fuel. Reporters finally listened. Human rights groups joined the fight. Even former prison guards stepped forward to say the system had gone too far. The state could no longer ignore what was happening behind those concrete walls. But the courtroom battles were fierce. California's lawyers argued that without the SHU, gangs would regain power. They painted a picture of chaos, murders, riots, bloodshed, if prisoners were let out of solitary. On the other side, Lobel and his team showed evidence of the mental destruction the SHU caused. They brought in psychologists who testified that years in a windowless cell caused permanent brain damage. They brought in prisoners who shook as they told their stories of voices, hallucinations, and despair. The testimony that shook the court most came from the man who had lived 30 years in the SHU. His voice was raspy, but his words cut like a knife. I forgot the sound of the ocean. I forgot the smell of grass. I forgot what it was like to hug my mother. You call this safety? I call this torture. The room fell silent. Even the judge looked shaken. Outside, the protests grew larger. News cameras caught families holding up pictures of their loved ones locked in solitary. Children held signs saying, "Bring my daddy home." The pressure built until the state realized the lawsuit couldn't be buried. They had to deal with it. After years of legal battles, in 2015, a historic settlement was reached. California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement. No longer could men be locked in the SHU for decades without an end date. Thousands of prisoners were released back into general population, some stepping into sunlight for the first time in 30 years. It was a victory unlike any in U.S. prison history. But even in victory, the scars remained. Many of the men released from the SHU struggled to adjust. Some couldn't sleep without walls around them. Others flinched at the sound of voices, unused to crowds after decades of silence. The lawsuit had won, but the human cost was written in the eyes of those who survived. And yet, not everyone celebrated. Behind closed doors, some prison officials whispered that the gangs were still watching, still waiting. They warned that releasing thousands of men from solitary would bring a new wave of violence. Reporters chased those rumors, but the truth was harder to pin down. Then one final shock rippled through the system. A hidden file surfaced, an internal report written by prison staff years earlier. It described something chilling found in the SHU, a secret communication system carved into the walls, used by prisoners to pass messages for decades. Officials had known about it but kept it buried, fearing the public would question whether solitary confinement had ever really stopped gangs at all. When that report leaked, the story of Pelican Bay's SHU exploded once again. The victory of the lawsuit was undeniable, but the questions left behind were even more haunting. If me, and could still reach one another through scratched codes on concrete walls, had the SHU truly silenced anyone? Or had it only created ghosts who lived in the cracks of Pelican Bay, waiting to be heard? And with that revelation, the story of the lawsuit closed. Not with peace, but with a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the darkest secrets are not destroyed, only hidden.